Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Andrew from Team Blacktop YGO here. Today I'm bringing you a video on, well, what it says on the screen right now, how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! I made this PowerPoint about almost a year ago, back in October of last year, to explain to my friends at the time, like sort of the in-depth stuff of Yu-Gi-Oh! And while this video will be very extensive, it will be very long, I promise you that. It's in order to fully understand how to play the game, you have to be immersed in it and to practice it. And then any sort of rulings that you need to figure out, you sort of need to be able to understand those because you've been playing a while. And if you don't understand anything, you can always look it up. But this will be a narrated guide. Of course, it'll also have a PowerPoint on the screen to show you like sort of what I'm talking about, but overall, I'm just going to be narrating this. So let's dig in. So the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game is a fun game involving several different types of cards, and using those cards to reduce your opponent's life points to 0. Really, any way you can win the game, like that's the goal, to win the game, right? Now, the main way is, of course, reducing your opponent's life points to 0. However, there are several alternate win conditions, but most of the time those are pretty straightforward because they're explained by the cards that implement those alternate win conditions. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and sort of explain how this game works. So we're going to go over the cards first. In order to do this, we might have like a roundabout way of getting there to the cards themselves, but this is how we're going to start out. So the main deck is your primary resource pool. Okay, it can start between anywhere between 40 and 60 cards. That means at the start of a duel, your main deck must have between 40 and 60 cards in it. There cannot be more, there cannot be less. Of course, after you start the duel, you draw your 5 cards or whatever, your main deck will have less than 40 cards in it. Okay, so that's okay. It just has to start with 40 to 60 cards. If you can't draw from your main deck during your draw phase, or really any time that you would draw a card, you lose the duel. So that means if you have no cards left and you have to draw, you lose. And then anytime you go into your main deck to like retrieve a specific card, if you're like special summoning it or adding it to your hand or sending it to the graveyard or banishing it, whatever, anytime you access your main deck to look for specific individual cards, you have to shuffle it and your opponent has to cut. It's pretty, it just makes sense. It's common sense, but that's what you have to do. So main deck cards here. Really in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Overall, there's just 3 types of cards. You got monsters, spells, and traps. There's different subtypes of these cards, but that's going to be explained in this video. Just so you know, 3 different types of cards, and all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Main deck has all 3 of them. So, monsters, let's get started with those. So, monster cards all have an attribute and a type, okay? So, attributes are basically like elements, or they are akin to elements. Light, dark, earth, wind, water, fire, or divine. Those are the attributes on monster cards. Anytime a card mentions a monster's attribute, it'll mention in all capital letters, okay? Just so you know. Now, types are sort of like more specific classifications of cards. It's like Aqua, Beast, Beast Warrior, Cybers, Dinosaur, Divine Beast, Dragon, Fairy, Fiend, Fish, Insect, Machine, Plant, Psychic, Pyro, Reptile, Rock, Sea Serpent, Spellcaster, Thunder, Warrior, Winged Beast, Worm, or Zombie. There's a whole bunch of them. The newest one is Cybers, as of the time of making this video, for the Link era, so it's pretty interesting. Yes, there's a whole bunch. Now, of course, whenever you get to playing the game, you will realize that some types and attributes are more heavily supported than others. Right now, we are seeing definitely a huge amount of support. Like Dark right now is the best attribute in the game. Like hands down, best attribute. Okay. All main deck monsters will have a level 1 through 12. Some extra deck monsters have a level as well, but not all of them do, and we'll get into that. And all monsters from the main deck have an attack value and a defense value. I will note that all monsters that are in the extra deck, which is another deck in Yu-Gi-Oh!, all of them have an attack value, but some of them do not have a defense value. We'll get to that later. And you know, as I said right here, Link monsters don't have a defense value or level, but they have a Link rating and Link arrows instead. XYZ monsters, or as it's appropriately called, Xyz monsters, they don't have a level, but they have a rank, 1 through 12, kind of like monster cards, how it goes from 1 to 12. Some of them don't have a rank at all. Some synchro monsters don't have a level, and if you don't know what a synchro monster is, we'll of course get into that. And then pendulum monsters, in addition to having levels and all this other stuff, they also have a pendulum scale number, which is 0 through 13, and of course we'll get into that later. So that's the overview of monsters. So for main deck monsters specifically, the first type is normal monster cards. They're a subtype, of course. They don't have an effect in their text box. They have a lore or backstory. So for example, the card on the screen is a Blue Eyes White Dragon. It's a normal monster. It says, this legendary dragon is a powerful engine of destruction, virtually indestructible. Very few have faced this creature and have lived to tell the tale. So it's not an effect, of course. It's just like a little cute story piece. All right. Normal monsters, depending on their level, require tributes to be normal, summoned, or set. So level 1 through 4, you don't have to tribute. All right. This goes for effect monsters as well. But sometimes effect monsters have alternate summoning conditions, like in order to special summon them, or sometimes they'll require three tributes to normal summon them, but it'll always say that on the card if it's something outside of this norm right here. So level 1 to 4, no tributes. Level 5 through 6, 1 tribute, and level 7 through 12 is 2 tributes. And if you don't know what the level is indicated by the number of stars on the card. That's right under the card's title box there. So if you see those kind of red and yellow star things, those are the levels of a monster. All right, that's what that is. So normal monsters, of course, the tribute requirements are there. Tributing means sending monsters from your field to the graveyard. That's the action they perform, but it's called tributing. So let's say I have one monster on my field, and I want to summon a level 5 monster. I send that monster from the deck to the graveyard, or from the field to the graveyard, rather, to summon or tribute set that tribute monster. So yeah, that's how that works. And then of course level 7 through 12 is 2 tributes, like I said. Effect monsters are basically like normal monsters, but they have an effect, and that's all it is. The majority of monsters used in the game today are effect monsters. I think the majority of monsters printed in the game are effect monsters. It's like there's hardly any decks today that run non-effect monsters. That's just how it is. Because effect monsters have effects, they do things that makes them better typically. So, like I said, they have an effect. Any non-normal monster can be an effect monster. But like because we're just talking about the main deck right now, we're not talking about Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Ixies, or Links, or Pendulum monsters. And I know I said main deck there, but Rituals and Pendulums are typically housed in the main deck. And then, of course, unless stated by its card text, effect monsters have the same tributing requirement as normal monsters. That's just how it works. Ritual monsters, here we go. Some of them are non-effect monsters, and some of them are effect monsters, as you can see here. For example, Blackluster Soldier on the left doesn't have any text in it besides it says, you can ritual summon this card with Blackluster Ritual. That is not really part of its effect, that's just sort of a qualifying thing. Really, if you look at the text of ritual spell cards, you probably don't have to have this text on the ritual monster itself. Just so you're aware, but it'll say that on there just so you know what to summon it with. Now, of course, on the right here we have Blackluster Soldier, Super Soldier. This one, of course, it's blurry. I can't read it from where I am, but besides saying you can ritual summon this card with Super Soldier Ritual, it also says like a bunch of other effects that it has. So yes, they can be non-effect monsters and effect monsters, but ritual monsters work kind of like basically you play the ritual spell card, and it requires you typically to tribute monsters from your hand or field. And like I said earlier, tributing is sending to the graveyard. So, but it's called tributing. That's like the official term for it. Some ritual spell cards do things a little bit differently. If you're looking at like Necroz, that's a deck, or that's an archetype that can ritual summon monsters different ways, crazy ways, and we'll kind of go over that a little bit later. So that's ritual monsters. Pendulum monsters, they're monster spell hybrids. That's the best way to describe them. They can be played as either as a spell card or a monster. If they're played as a spell, they are placed in the pendulum zones on the field. Those are the left and rightmost zones of the spell and trap zone. And then when they're summoned as a monster, they go into the main monster zones when summoned from anywhere but the extra deck, or into the extra monster zone when special summoned from the extra deck. The general rule of thumb for extra deck summoning is that if you control no link monsters and there's an open extra monster zone, and no link monsters on the field point to your main monster zones, you have to summon it to the extra monster zone. Doesn't matter if it is a non-pendulum monster or a pendulum monster. Has to go to the extra monster zone or a zone a link monster points to. That's the rule of thumb for any extra deck summoning. And then so we can kind of see here on the picture of Guiding Ariadne in the corner. It looks kind of like a regular monster. It, of course, has a level, attribute, type, attack, and defense. But this also has this little text box right here, right directly underneath the artwork. that is the pendulum spell effect. So if you activate it as a spell card in your pendulum zone, that's the effect that's going to be applying. And this pendulum scale right here, this number 3, it's on both sides of the pendulum spell effect text box. That is relevant whenever you're performing a pendulum summon. And I'll explain that later, like I said. And of course, the weird mechanic with pendulum monsters is that if they would be sent to the graveyard after being properly activated or summoned, they don't go there. They go face up on the extra deck. This mechanic, prior to the current Master Rule, Master Rule 4 is the current one, which is basically the Link Master Rule. Before that, pendulum monsters were kind of broken, and by broken I mean overpowered in this regard. But that's enough about this for right now. So there's some subtypes of monsters as well. Flip effect monsters have effects when they activate when they're summoned, flip face up, or otherwise change from face down defense position, which is called being set, to a face up position. It's like literally when they're flipped. Union monsters, they kind of work like, they behave kind of like spell cards, like equip spell cards, which I'll explain that later, of course. But they can equip themselves to other monsters. Like ABCs were probably the most relevant Union deck in recent memory, but they never equip themselves typically to their own monsters with their own effects. So that's Union for you. Any effect like Union or Gemini, anything besides Flip, and I think maybe even Flip now, I'm not exactly sure, but all these subtypes will be stated in that little line in the opening part of the monster's text box that says like their type and effect or not. It'll say like Union or Gemini in there, just so you're aware. So anyway, Gemini monsters are monsters that are treated as normal monsters while on the field, hand, deck, or graveyard in most cases. But the thing is, if you normal summon them, you can normal summon them again while face up on the field, and they get like an effect. Typically nobody uses these because like there's no point. Who wants to normal summon twice just to get a subpar effect? But just so you know, it is a type or a subtype of monster. We have spirit monsters. Of course, it'll also say spirit on the card in the card text. These monsters all have an effect that returns them to the hand at the end of the turn. And then tuner monsters, it'll say tuner in that first line of big text in the card effect box. Tuner monsters are monsters that are required for a synchro summon, and we'll get to that later when we talk about synchros, etc. And that's about it for the monsters in the main deck. Now we have spell cards as well. There's also subtypes of spell cards. We have normal spells, which are the most basic type of spells, quick play, continuous ritual, field, and equip spells. Typically, unless they're continuous, as the name implies, spell cards are sent to the graveyard, typically. There are a couple of special cases, and I guess field spells aren't readily sent to the graveyard too, but all the other ones are. So normal spell cards, they're the most basic type of spell. They can be activated during your main phase 1 or 2 only, and you can set them. Any sort of spell or trap card you can set on your field, which means you place it face down in your spell and trap zone, and you can activate it from your hand during your main phase 1 or 2, of course. And then, like regular spells, they are sent to the graveyard after their effect resolves. They're pretty basic, not hard to figure out. Quick play spell cards, they behave sort of like trap cards, except there's one major difference, and that is, while trap cards, and we'll go over this mechanic a little bit later, but trap cards have to be set for at least one turn before they can be played, or they have to be set on a previous turn, rather, typically, in most cases. Quick play spell cards can be activated on your turn as a spell speed 2 card. Trap cards are also spell speed 2 in most cases. We'll get to that later as well. It's a lot of stuff I know coming at you right away, but that's just how it works. So quick play spell cards can be played as normal spells, like, resembling them at least. They can be chained to stuff, which we'll go over later, or they can be set on your turn and activated as trap cards on subsequent turns. Even though it is a spell card, if you do set it on your turn, you cannot activate it during your turn, during the same turn. So for example, we have Mystical Space Typhoon here. Let's say I want to set this card on my field, do some stuff, and then later in the same turn activate Mystical Space Typhoon. I cannot do that because I already set it on the field. This is the only spell card that behaves this way. The rest of the spell cards, normal, equip, field, continuous, and ritual, they don't behave that way. But quick play spells do. They behave like traps if you set them. That's just how that works. And of course, like with any spell card, they have to meet the conditions on the card, which we'll go over later during reading card text, in order to activate them. And they're also denoted, most importantly, they're denoted by this lightning bolt shape right next to the spell card wording in the bottom right corner below the title box. Continuous spell cards, these are kind of unlike most other spell cards. They stay on the field after you activate them. They're like normal spells in the sense that you can only activate them during your main phase 1 or 2. And the thing about continuous spells and also field spells, and I guess equip spells, technically, they have to be face up on the field when the card effect resolves in order for that card effect to go off. So for example, Dark Magical Circle's effect says, when this card is activated, look at the top 3 cards of your deck, then you can reveal one Dark Magician or one Spell Trap card that specifically lists the card Dark Magician among them, and add it to your hand, and then place the remaining cards on the top of your deck in any order. So let's say, for example, you activate Dark Magical Circle during your turn, and your opponent has that Mystical Space Typhoon, alright? If your opponent chains Mystical Space Typhoon, which we'll talk about this a little bit later, to your activation of Dark Magical Circle, and destroys Dark Magical Circle, you will not get that effect on activation of Dark Magical Circle, because the ruling for field spell cards, for continuous spell cards, field spell cards, and I suppose equip spell cards, it's that they have to be face up on the field to resolve. So that's how that works. And like I said, these, if it's not destroyed, it'll remain on the field until it's removed via card effect. Ritual spell cards are kind of normal spells, except they're used to ritual summon ritual monsters. They will require tributes from the hand or field. Typically, like I said, the Necros archetype, they do some crazy shenanigans with how they ritual summon their monsters. But typically that's how it works. You can only activate them during your main phase 1 or 2, much like normal continuous equip spells, field spells. Pretty straightforward. I kind of already explained this a little bit in the ritual monster section, but on the ritual spell cards, it'll typically say like what kind of monster it can summon. Sometimes it'll list a specific name. However, in the case of this card here on the screen, Advanced Ritual Art, this says this card can be used as ritual summon any one ritual monster. So any ritual monster you want, provided that it can be ritual summoned with any card, can be summoned with Advanced Ritual Art. You just have to meet the conditions on the card. So that's ritual spell cards. Equip spell cards. Oh, and in case you didn't notice, on ritual spell cards, they have this like flame symbol here for their like indicator symbol or whatever. Just so you know, equip spell cards. Whenever they're activated, they target a monster on the field and they equip themselves to it. So these are like continuous and field spell cards in that they remain on the field, provided that the monster that they are equipped to is also on the field. So for example, if the monster that it was equipped to on the field leaves the field somehow, the equip spell card is sent to the graveyard. And the equip symbol is this like little crosshairs looking thing. I don't know what you want to call that, but a crosshairs type symbol there. Field spell cards, these don't go in the spell and trap zone. I guess I should have said that for the other ones, but all spell and trap cards will go in the spell and trap zone, except field spell cards. They have their own special zone. And of course, like continuous spell cards, if it has an effect on activation, but it gets destroyed or moved from the field, its effect will not resolve. Like I said, which is like continuous spell cards. That's an important ruling to remember. It's just inherent in the mechanic of the card itself. It used to be, when pertaining to controlling field spell cards, it used to be that only one player could control one at a time. So like if my opponent controlled a field spell card and I activated a new one, theirs would be sent to the graveyard or whatever, but now both players can control them, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. And then the symbol, the indicator symbol for a field spell card is this little 4-pointed star right here. And that's it for the spell cards. Now on to trap cards here. So there's 3 types of trap cards. You have normal trap cards, continuous trap cards, and counter trap cards. Of course, you have like normal, continuous, like spell cards, but trap cards are different because they have to be set in the spell and trap zone during the previous turn until they can be activated. So for example, if on my turn I set a trap card, on my opponent's turn, provided that I can appropriately activate it at that time, I can activate it then. Alright, so that's that. Normal trap cards, and of course just like any other spell and trap card besides continuous ones, these cards are sent to the graveyard after they're resolved. Trap cards, normal trap cards and continuous trap cards at least are spell speed 2, which will be explained later. Like Jar of Greed right here is very simple. It just says draw a card, so you don't have to meet any conditions really on the card. It doesn't say like when your opponent summons a monster, draw a card. It just says draw a card. So you could literally activate this anytime you wanted. Continuous trap cards, like continuous spells, they remain face up on the field unless they're removed by a card effect or some other reason. And of course, because it is a continuous style card, if it is removed from the field, its effect will not resolve if one was activated. So if I activate Eternal Soul's effect to special summon a Dark Magician from my hand or graveyard, and my opponent, uses Mystical Space Typhoon or something to destroy Eternal Soul, if Eternal Soul is destroyed, its effect will not resolve, and I do not get to special summon that said Dark Magician. It's pretty straightforward. The continuous cards, like continuous spells, traps, field spells, the rulings and the mechanics surrounding those are pretty easy once you get to know them. Counter trap cards, these are typically the most powerful trap cards in the game. What makes them powerful is that they have the highest spell speed, speed 3. And like I said, I'll explain this later, but counter trap cards have this little counter arrow symbol. It's like a curved arrow. And typically they are always activated in response to something happening. So for example, Solemn Strike here says when a monster would be special summoned or a monster effect is activated, something happens, so then you activate Solemn Strike. That's how I think probably all counter trap cards work. And that's just inherent to their mechanic, basically. So now we're going to talk about the extra deck. So we're done with the main deck now. We're going to go to the extra deck. The extra deck is like a supplement to the main deck. Typically, you can access this deck at any time you want, provided that you are able to. And we'll kind of explain that later. You can have up to 15 cards in your extra deck. The extra deck initially contains Fusion, Synchro, Ixies, Link monsters only. Now, of course, like I said, with the Pendulum monsters, they can be face up on the extra deck at certain times if they are destroyed or they otherwise leave the field. They'll go face up to the extra deck. Now, Link monsters, which we're about to talk about, they aren't the first type of extra deck summoning mechanic to be introduced into the game, but they're the most important, so when we get to those, I'll talk about those first. The extra monster zone, it's important to talk about this as well. Any one extra deck monster can be summoned to an extra monster zone at a time, and provided you have an extra link to your opponent, you can only control one monster in a extra monster zone. Now, of course, the caveat is with Link monsters, which I'll explain in a second, if they have arrows that point to your field, or you control a Link monster that points to your field with its arrows, you can summon monsters from your extra deck to those zones that the Link monster points to. So, Link monsters, they are a type of monster special summoned from the extra deck. They're blue colored, kind of like rituals, but they're a little bit darker, and they have like this hexagon pattern on the card. Nevertheless, they have arrows that point to zones on the field. They have no level or defense points, only link ratings and link arrows. And because they don't have defense points, they just cannot be put in defense position. So cards like Book of Boon, which says target one monster your opponent controls, change it to face down defense position, those cards do not work on Link monsters. Makes sense because they can't be put in defense position. They don't have a defense. There's a couple reasons that the maker of this game did that. Typically, the most obvious reason would be that if you could change the battle positions of Link monsters, the arrows would be like sort of convoluted, because the arrows have to remain static on a card. So if you change the position of a Link monster, the arrows would be pointing in different places, and that'd just be kind of weird. Link monsters are link summoned by sending monsters you control to the graveyard, and by placing them in an extra monster zone or zone Link monster points to, as with any sort of extra deck special summoning mechanic. And the monsters you send to the graveyard are called Link materials. It's also pretty straightforward. They look like this, as I said. They are like other monsters because they have the attribute, the type, card text, attack, But as you can see here on Decode Talker, it has 3 arrows. It's got one pointing up and 2 to the one on the bottom left and one on the bottom right. Its link rating is 3. The link rating of a card will always be equal to the number of arrows it has. Now, this is a little side panel here about link material requirements. So, whenever you summon a link monster, you have to use monsters, like a number of monsters that adds up to the link rating of that card. So, for example, Decode Talker says 2+ effect monsters for its requirement. So, I could use 3 just regular monsters, or 3 effect monsters rather, 3 regular effect monsters to make Decode Talker. However, as it says here, if I were to summon a Link 3 monster like Decode Talker, and its requirements were 2+ monsters, I could use a regular non-Link monster and a Link 2 monster to Link summon this card. Because you have a Link 2, so 2 plus 1 for the regular non-Link monster, 2 plus 1 is 3. It just adds up the numbers, alright? That's pretty straightforward. It's easier to figure out once you've sort of practiced it a little bit, but that's how link monsters kind of work. Another thing to note about link monsters is that whenever you use a link monster for a link summon, let's say for example, I want to use a link 2 monster for a link summon for Decode Talker. So I could, like this scenario here, use a non-link monster and a link 2 monster. But if I really wanted to, for some reason, I could treat that link 2 monster as a link 1 monster. So I could use 2 regular non-link monsters and a link 2 monster treated as a link 1 to summon the link 3 Decode Talker. Okay, 1 non-regular monster plus 1 non-regular monster plus 1 link 2 monster. That link rating could still be 3 because I could treat the link 2 as a link 1. And that goes for any number link monster. So I could treat a link 3 as a link 1, link 4 as a link 1, just whatever you want to do. But of course, I could also treat that link 2 as a link 2 if I wanted to. Just so you know, it's kind of confusing just saying it, but once you put it into practice, it's very easy to understand. So, this is kind of how the configuration works here. So, Decode Talker, like I said, has an up pointing arrow and a bottom left, bottom right. So both players can special summon monsters to their field that link monsters point to. So right now, I could summon monsters to the 2 zones that Decode Talker is pointing to. I guess I'll use my mouse here to sort of point them out, but it's this one here, this one here. Now my opponent, they could always summon a monster from the extra deck to this zone right here, to the other extra monster zone. But because my link monster points to their field, Decode Talker's up arrow in this case, they could also summon a monster from the extra deck to that zone. So they could summon 2 monsters if it wasn't a link monster over here. Of course, they could control their own link monster, and it could have the arrows that point to their field as well, so they could summon even more monsters from the extra deck. But that's basically how it works. Anything a link monster points to, you can summon extra deck monsters to, or you can summon them to the extra monster zone. That's just how it works. So fusion monsters, this was the first type of extra deck summoning mechanic. In fact, back when Yu-Gi-Oh! First started, the extra deck was called the fusion deck because that was the only type of monster in it. Fusion monsters are typically special summoned with a fusion spell card, like polymerization. There's other ones like super polymerization, fusion substitute, El Shadal fusion, Shadal fusion. There's a whole bunch of them. Some fusion monsters can be special summoned with their own effect by tributing monsters from your field or banishing certain monsters. The slang for this is contact fusion. It's not an official term, but it's slang for it. Sometimes you don't have to use cards. That's just how it works. And then fusion monsters, like regular monsters, they have levels, types, attributes, attacks, defense, and sometimes they have an effect, sometimes they don't. Typically, you never see a fusion monster without an effect nowadays. It's just a really weird thing to see. So you never see it. And then so fusion monsters have this purple, this violet color here. The fusion material requirements are listed, I'll use my mouse again here, on the top line of the card text here, top line being the one that actually starts the card text and not the one that includes the monster's type and if it's an effect monster or not. Now over here on the right, polymerization and invocation, these are some spell cards that are used to conduct fusion summons. It'll say on the card here, if you read invocation, it says fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from your hand as fusion material, and it has some other stuff on it too, but that's basically how fusion spell cards work, and that's how you mainly fusion summon fusion monsters. On to synchro monsters. These monsters are colored white. They also have a level, attribute, attack, defense, type, the regular stuff. But fusion monsters are a little bit different. These require sometimes specific, but sometimes generic monsters. By that I mean, for example, Azure Silver Dragon over here on the right, its materials, which it'll say in the top line of the card text, like I said, 1 tuner plus 1 plus non-tuner normal monsters. So this is a more specific one because it requires a normal monster. Now, what are tuners and non-tuners, you might ask? Well, tuners are cards that have a line in their text that specifically says tuner. So you can see here at the top of the text box of Sage with Eyes of Blue over on the left here, it says spellcaster/tuner/effect. How synchros work is that you add the levels of the monsters used for the synchro summon to get the monster, or to get the level of the synchro monster you want to summon. So we have a level 1 Sage with Eyes of Blue tuner, we have a level 8 Blue Eyes White Dragon non-tuner, and we have a level 9 synchro monster. So 1 plus 8 equals 9. Pretty straightforward there. And how this works is you just send them from your field to the graveyard. Now there are some that like allow you to synchro from hand, which is kind of weird, but typically, like standard mechanic wise, it's always from your field to the graveyard. Now of course you'll have some synchro monsters that are like kind of weird. You'll have some that say, oh well, this has to be 2 tuners and a non-tuner monster, or like 1 tuner synchro monster plus 2 non-tuner synchro monsters or something. That's the last one there is typically called, in slang terms, an Excel synchro. But that's how that works. It's always going to be at least 1 non-tuner and 1 tuner monster. And of course they're sent from the field to the graveyard like any other sort of extra deck summoning mechanic. Xyz monsters, XYZ, Xyz, the correct name is Xyz, but it's spelled XYZ. These are probably the easiest to use. The mechanic is kind of weird, but like in terms of the math behind it, they're the easiest to use. But they don't have a level. They have a rank, which can be 1 through 12. Some of them have 0 for a rank, which is kind of weird, but typically it's 1 through 12. You never ever hardly see a 0 rank monster. Now, instead of the materials for these monsters being sent to the graveyard, they're actually put underneath of it, called overlaying. That's like the slang, I guess. Now, a lot of Xyz monsters have effects that deal with detaching Xyz material. So, when you have cards underneath an Xyz monster that were used to summon it, or put there by other means, those are its Xyz material, so you can detach one. So if you look at the next slide here, let's say, for example, I have 2 level 8 Blue Eyes White Dragons. How Xyz monsters work is you have to have monsters with the same level. So, now this Xyz monster right here, number 38, Hope Harbinger Dragon, Titanic Galaxy, it's hard to read here, but it says it requires 2 level 8 monsters. So what you do is you kind of overlay them on top of each other and then put the Xyz monster on top of it. And of course, you can kind of see here these black and yellow stars sort of on the bottom left of the card title box. That's its rank. Not a level, it's a rank. So Xyz monsters have ranks that are equal to the levels of the same leveled monsters used to summon them. It's easy in practice. I know it might sound kind of confusing here, but it's easy in practice once you get to do it. Now, one of the weird mechanics behind Xyz monsters is that the materials underneath of it that are overlaid underneath of it, they don't count as being on the field even though the Xyz monster is on the field. It's kind of weird. I don't believe they count as being sent to the graveyard either if they're detached in some way, shape, or form, or if the Xyz monster is sent to the graveyard. That's just a weird thing. And I guess I should note that if the Xyz monster is sent to the graveyard while it has material, the material are sent to the graveyard as well. Just so you know. So that's it for the extra deck summoning mechanics. If you practice them and get to know them a little bit better, they're a lot easier to understand. But now we're on to the side deck. The side deck is really only used in tournament play. It consists of up to 15 cards used in tournaments because they have matches in tournaments. Each round in a tournament consists of a match, which is a best 2 out of 3 duels. Cards from the side deck can be substituted for cards in the main deck and or extra deck between the duels in a match. So for example, if I had 2 cards in my side deck that I wanted to put in my main deck for game 2 or 3 of a match, I would have to take out 2 cards from my main deck if I wanted to put 2 cards from the side deck in it, so that the total cards in my main deck remain the same. So if I had a 40 card main deck, wanted to put 2 from the side deck in, I'd have 42, then I have to take 2 more cards from my main deck out of it and put them into the side deck so that I would have 40 cards in the main deck. And it works the same way with the extra deck too. If you put 2 cards in there, and you have to take out 2 cards so that you have like 15 or whatever number you started with. This is used to sort of get your deck to have a better matchup or a better like strategy against different decks that you see in a tournament. The contents of this deck, much like the contents of your main deck and extra deck, are not public knowledge, and you yourself cannot look through your side deck during a duel. I don't know if I mentioned this on the extra deck part or the main deck part, but you cannot look through your main deck unless you are required to via a card effect during a duel. Now you can look through your extra deck. Sorry, you can look through your extra deck, but your opponent cannot. And that's just how that works. So, in summary, all cards are either going to be in the main or extra deck at the start of a duel. Your main deck has between 40 and 60 cards. Extra deck holds a max of 15, and the side deck holds a max of 15. And like I said earlier, you and your opponent are not allowed to look through your main deck or side deck during a duel unless a card effect allows you to look through your main deck to like search or send to the graveyard or special summon from deck. But you can look through your extra deck. Your opponent cannot know the contents of your extra deck, at least cards that are face down. So now, if you have any face-up monsters on your extra deck, like Pendulum monsters, your opponent can look through those. Those are public knowledge to your opponent. But yeah, that's how that works there. So now we're going to talk about the field. So the field, here's a nice little picture of it. I will say those two blue zones at the top, they're not technically called link monster zones, they're called extra monster zones. As we can see here, you have five monster zones in your main monster zones, and then there's two extra monster zones in the field. One of them is used by you, one of them by your opponent. That's just the choice, like it's whoever gets there first. Sometimes you can control both of these zones if you have performed an extra link, which will be explained a little bit later. You have 5 spell and trap zones here at the bottom. I kind of use my mouse here to sort of point them out, but you have 5 of those. And your left and rightmost zones of your spell and trap zones are pendulum zones. That's where you activate pendulum monsters as spell cards. Here we have the deck zone over here, extra deck zone, field zone, your graveyard, and your banished zone, and your side deck zone. These two zones, side deck zone and banished zones, aren't like actual zones. They're just there for convenience purposes of this mat. It's just on the picture I took. So main deck zones, where your main deck is placed, obviously. You know, that's pretty straightforward there. Graveyard, so any mention of the graveyard in a card's card text will be abbreviated to GY, capital G, capital Y. These are public knowledge to both players. Your opponent can look through it at any time, and so can you. Your cards in the graveyard should be kept in the order that they were sent there. You shouldn't rearrange the order of cards in your graveyard. It's hard to like sort of adhere to this rule, but that's just how it goes. And then cards are sent to the graveyard when they're destroyed or sent there via card effect or by the mechanic of a card itself. So by that last part, by the mechanic of a card itself, that means like if I have 2 monsters and I want to link summon a monster, I send those cards to the graveyard to summon that link monster. That's what I mean by the mechanic of the card itself. Now, I will note, this is kind of weird. So we know that Fusion, Synchro, Ixies, and Link monsters are initially special summoned from the extra deck. However, if they've been properly Fusion, Synchro, Ixie, or Link summoned, depending on their card type, if they're sent to the graveyard, you can special summon them from the graveyard with like a card effect to your main monster zone. Like I said, provided if they've been properly summoned first. So this comes up sometimes, but this basically means like you don't always have to summon them to your extra monster zone or to a zone a link monster points to if you're not special summoning them from the extra deck. Banished zone is not a true zone, like I said a little bit earlier. Face-up banished cards are public knowledge to both players. Banished is kind of like the graveyard, but it's like more finite or set in stone. Typically, you can't really access cards that are banished. There aren't really a whole lot of cards in the game to access this area or this location, but that's how that works. Face-down banished cards are knowledge only to the player who owns them. So, for example, there's a card called Pot of Desires. Pot of Desires is a normal spell card that its activation cost is to banish the top 10 cards of your deck face down. You can look through those cards, your opponent cannot. However, if you banish 3 cards face up, or banish any number of cards face up rather, both you and your opponent can look through those. Older cards will say remove from play in their card text as opposed to banishing. That was just sort of a terminology change, but banishing and removing from play are the same thing. And then the same sort of rule with like extra deck monsters kind of applies with the banished zone as do the graveyard. So if they're properly special summoned first, if they would then be special summoned from the banished area, banished pile, banished zone, whatever, they can be special summoned to a main monster zone. That's just how that works. Alright, extra deck zone is where your extra deck is placed. Yeah, pretty straightforward. You already know about the public knowledge stuff. Side deck zone, it's not a side deck. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but the number of cards in your side deck cannot be more than 15. Kind of like your extra deck, same size. Alright, so main monster zones. This is where monsters summoned from anywhere, but the extra deck will be played. Of course, if there are link monsters in either player's extra monster zone or in either player's field that point to your main monster zones, you can special summon monsters from the extra deck to those zones, to the zones that are pointed at. If you have a card effect that summons a token, they are always summoned to the main monster zones. Trap monsters, which are certain kind of trap cards that special summon themselves as monsters when you activate them, they are also special summoned to the main monster zone, and you can only control 5 because there's only 5 main monster zones. Spell and trap zones, this is where you play spell and trap cards, as the name implies. there's only 5 zones in this one too. And then, like I said, when I talked about pendulums, the far left and far right sides of a spell and trap zone are treated as pendulum zones, while pendulum monsters are activated in them. Now, just as a note, some monster cards will have effects like the artifact archetype in particular. They have effects that allow you to set them in your spell and trap zone as like spell cards or something. Typically, you cannot put monsters in your spell and trap zones, but only certain card effects will allow you to do that. So field zone, field spell zone, whatever you want to call it, this is where field spell cards are played. You can also set them in the zone. You don't necessarily have to activate them right away. You can always set them. And then both players can control a field spell card at the same time. Now, if you have if there's a card effect that would affect spell and trap cards you control, like let's say there's a card called Hey Trunade. Hey Trunade's effect, it's a normal spell card with the effect of return all set spell and trap cards on the field to the hand. So for example, if you have, like, let's say you have 2 cards set in your spell and trap zone, and you have a field spell card that is not activated but set in your field zone, it would return all of those to your hand. Not just the ones in the spell and trap zone, but also the one in the field spell zone, provided that it is set. Just so you know. Pendulum zones, going along the same sort of spell trap thing that are left and rightmost zones of the spell and trap. They're only treated as pendulum zones when there's a face-up pendulum monster in the zone. Now, the weird thing about pendulum monsters, if you're activating them as spell cards, you can't set them. You can only activate them face-up in the pendulum zone. So there is a continuous trap card called Anti-Spell Fragrance that says both players must set spell and trap cards before activating, or set spell cards before activating them. If your opponent has this card and is playing against you, you cannot use pendulum monsters because they cannot be set. And because you have to set spell cards before activating them, this basically shuts off the ability for you to use pendulums, which kind of sucks, but that's just kind of how that ruling goes. And then, of course, because pendulum zones take up 2 slots of your spell and trap zone, they do count towards the total of 5 spell and traps you can control at any given time in your spell and trap zones. Extra monster zone, there's 2 of these on the field. This is where you summon monsters from the extra deck. Only 1 monster can be summoned to an extra monster zone at a time. If you're, and the whole thing with the link arrows, if your opponent controls a link monster in an extra monster zone that has link arrows that point to a main monster zone on the field, you can special summon monsters from the extra deck to those zones as well. And a player can only control a monster in one of the extra monster zones unless they've performed an extra link, which I will get into a little bit later. Extra linking has to do with co-linking, which is an official terminology. Co-linking is essentially when 2 link monsters have link arrows that point towards each other. So, I'll go through that a little bit later, but we'll get into this right now. We're going to go through the turn and how a turn works. Each turn is divided into phases. The order of phases is draw phase, standby phase, main phase 1, battle phase, main phase 2, and end phase. I had to take a drink there. Sorry about that. Typically, a player must go through all these phases to complete a turn. And then the turn player's opponent can activate traps or quick play spells at the end of each phase. Really, it is correct, but it's a broader statement. There is a certain time and place when people can activate traps or quick play spells. I will probably not go over that in this video. That is something you sort of have to learn after you get the basics of the game down. I know this is a long video, but this is, in essence, a basics video of the game. So that is how that's going to work. Let's see here. The next thing is the draw phase. So the first phase of a turn is the draw phase. In this phase, the turn player draws a card from their main deck. If it's the first turn of a duel, the turn player does not draw a card. Sometimes card effects will allow players to do or to not do certain things in the draw phase. So, like, there's a normal trap card called Reckless Greed that says, draw 2 cards, then skip your next 2 draw phases. So if Reckless Greed's effect is applying, you won't draw during your draw phase, or for at least 2 of them. That's what I mean by that statement there. Standby phase, this comes after the draw phase and is before your main phase 1. This is sort of a don't do anything unless something has to be done during this phase. There's not a whole lot that goes on here. Yeah, that's just what the standby phase is. It's for cards and effects that specifically activate or resolve during this time of the game. And of course, like, players can appropriately activate spells and trap cards or monster effects at appropriate times in the standby phase. Main phase 1, this is where all the big stuff happens. This is the third phase of a turn. The turn player is allowed to normal summon or set 1 monster. The turn player is allowed to perform an unlimited amount of special summons provided they are of the correct type, and the turn player is allowed to perform 1 pendulum summon. If you don't understand what I mean by turn player, I mean the player, I'm referring to the player whose turn it currently is. This phase is where everything happens but battling. You can search for cards, summon monsters, activate spells and traps, do a whole bunch of other stuff. And then your opponent is allowed to appropriately respond, and we'll get into card effects and like responding to stuff a little bit later. Battle phase, this is where monsters battle each other. Battle phase, this is going to be a long section of the video. Battle phase, even though it seems very straightforward, it is in actuality sort of complicated when it comes to how it is ruled and how the mechanics work. There's a process, and we'll go through that a little bit later. But the turn player does not have to go through this phase. If the turn player skips the battle phase, if they go to main phase 1 or whatever, and they skip the battle phase, they do not go on to the next phase. They do not go on to main phase 2. It goes directly to the end phase, which I'll talk about in a bit. But main phase 2 is like main phase 1, but after the battle phase. If the turn player has not conducted their normal summon or set, or their pendulum summon that turn, they can do that now, and then they can sort of do all the other stuff that they did during the main phase of 1, if they need to do it or whatever. And then, like I said, if the player skips their battle phase, this phase does not occur. It goes directly to the end phase. This is the ending part of the turn. Some card effects activate or resolve during the end phase, depending on what you're doing or what you're playing. And then after this phase is over, it's the end of the turn, and so it is the next player's turn. Now we're going to talk about summoning monsters. So there's a lot of terms I threw out, like normal summoning, pendulum summoning, and special summoning. And I'll sort of get to that in this section of the video. There are several types of summons you can conduct. These types can be further broken down, and usually you summon on your own turn. Now, there are cases where you summon on your opponent's turn, but typically that does not happen. So, normal summoning. This is the most basic type of summoning in the game. You're only allowed one of them per turn. And also, set is what is, you're only allowed one normal summon or set. So, a normal summon consists of summoning a normal or regular effect monster in face-up attack position. If you don't understand what I mean by attack position and defense position, attack position means like you're putting the card on the field in a vertically oriented position where you can read it without having to turn your head or anything like that. Defense position is if you turn it sideways in a horizontally oriented position. A set consists of placing a normal or regular effect monster in face-down defense position. And like I said earlier, the tributing requirements, depending on the level of the monster you're summoning or setting, it holds true in this. So level 5 and 6 require 1 tribute to normal summon or set, and then level 7 on up requires 2 tributes. But that is your normal summon or set. You only get one of those per turn. Now, if you set a monster, for example, you cannot flip summon it during the same turn. Typically, for most cards, I will say, you can't set them and then activate them during the same turn. Now, of course, like if it's a normal spell, equips anything but a quick play spell, in terms of spell cards, you can set them and activate them, but all other cards, if you set them, you can't really flip them face up during the same turn. Now, a special ruling with Gemini monsters here. So like I said earlier, Gemini monsters are monsters you can normal summon or special summon once, and then you have to normal summon them again, so they gain their Gemini, quote-unquote Gemini effects. That's not an official term, that's what they call it. However, you can't like normal summon a Gemini monster and then normal summon it directly after it during the same turn. That's just not how it works. You only get one normal summon per turn, so Gemini monsters, if you normal summon it and you try to normal summon it again, that's not going to work because you'll have normal summon twice in one turn, which is a no-go. There are some card effects that allow you to normal summon twice, but typically, as per the mechanics of the game, you're not going to be able to do that. So, that's that. And of course, like if you read this right here, if let's say you have a level 7 Gemini monster and you tribute summon it using 2 tributes. If you wish to normal summon it again, you don't have to tribute 2 more monsters if it's already on the field to get its like Gemini effect or whatever. Flip summoning, this is when you, like if your monster has already been set during a previous turn, and being set means face down defense position if you don't know, but if you have your monster set, you flip it to face up attack position, and you can conduct an unlimited number of these flip summons provided that the monsters were set during a previous turn. And of course, because some monsters have flip effects, they are activated when a monster is flip summoned. Now, special summoning, this is a blanket term, okay? Fusion summoning, synchro summoning, Ixie summoning, link summoning, ritual summoning, and pendulum summoning are all considered forms of special summoning. That's not really all of them. Sometimes there's like other types of just special summons that you perform. Now I will say you can special summon, or you can conduct a pendulum summon only once per turn, but pendulum summons allow you to special summon multiple monsters. So that's kind of why it's considered a special summon. And really, a pendulum summon is considered a special summon because it is not a normal summon or set. It's special. All right. Ritual summoning. This is a basic type of special summoning. It requires a ritual spell card to ritual summon. Ritual spell cards typically require you to tribute monsters from your hand or field. Sometimes they'll have other different ways to ritual summon, but it'll always require some sort of tribute, or sending a monster somewhere. Every ritual monster says what ritual spell card is supposed to be used to ritual summon it, and then typically ritual spell cards will say like what monsters they can be used to ritual summon. But when it comes to like the sort of requirements or whatever, or the qualifications of a ritual spell card, it's typically up to the ritual spell card and not the ritual monster of how that works. And the ritual monsters, because they're not an extra deck summoning mechanic, they're ritual summons to the main monster zone. And the same sort of thing applies here for ritual monsters. So for example, if let's say I sent a ritual monster from my deck to the graveyard without properly special summoning it, or properly ritual summoning it first, I cannot special summon that monster back from the graveyard because it was not properly ritual summoned. That's how that works. Pendulum summoning, you can only conduct one of these per turn, and I'll go over this. This is where I'm going to go over this sort of thing. So you can only conduct a pendulum summon if you control a pendulum monster in both of your pendulum zones, and if those pendulum monsters have a different scale. When a player pendulum summons, you can special summon monsters from your hand and face up from your extra deck, provided that the levels of those monsters being summoned are between the pendulum scales on the pendulum monsters you control in your pendulum zones. And if this sounds confusing, don't worry, I'll explain it a little bit. And of course, this sort of caveat that applies for all monsters special summoned from the extra deck. If you're special summoning pendulum monsters that are face up on your extra deck, even though they're not what you would consider regular extra deck monsters, they still can only be summoned to the extra monster zone or to a zone A link monster points too. So here we go. Here's a little bit of a exercise here in pendulum summoning. So you can kind of see on this field here that I have two pendulum monsters in my pendulum zones. Excuse me. You have an astrograph sorcerer over here with a pendulum scale of 1, and over here on the right you have a chronograph sorcerer with a pendulum scale of 8. So what this means is that you can, whenever you conduct a pendulum summon, you can pendulum summon monsters between the levels of 1 and 8 exclusive. So that means 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Alright? In my hand I have a level 8 Blue Eyes White Dragon and a level 7 Dark Magician. On top of my extra deck face up, I have a level 4 Pendulum Monster. So I will conduct a Pendulum Summon here, and this is what happens. The Double Iris Magician that was face up on my extra deck goes to the extra monster zone because there are no link monsters on the field that point anywhere. And it's level 4, so I'm allowed to Pendulum Summon it. The level 7 Dark Magician in my hand, I'm allowed to Pendulum Summon as well, and because it's from my hand, it goes to my main monster zone and not the extra monster zone. It only goes to the main monster zone if it's from your hand. It's a level 7 because its level lies between 1 and 8, which are the pendulum scales, my two pendulum spells I control. This level 8 Blue Eyes, though, in my hand, I could not special summon it with the pendulum summon because it's level 8, it does not lie between the pendulum scales of the cards. Even though Chronograph Sorcerer over here on the right has a pendulum scale of 8, the level of the monsters I want to summon have to be exclusive of those. So, like I said earlier, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's what I could have summoned there. So that's how that pendulum summoning works. Pendulum summoning is an inherent special summon, and I'll kind of go over what that means a little bit later, but that's just kind of how that works. Fusion summoning, as I said when I talked about fusions, typically done with a spell card. Most of the time the fusion materials are sent from the hand or field to the graveyard. Of course, like any sort of extra deck summoning mechanic, the material requirements for a card to be special summoned are on the card itself. So you'll know it's the first line of text after the type of card and the effect and whether it's an effect monster or not. And then sometimes the fusion monster has an effect on the card itself that says like you can special summon this card by tributing a monster you control or of a certain type or a certain monster you control. You have to watch out though because sometimes like cards like that will say must be either fusion summoned or special summoned by performing a certain action. All right. If you special summon it by performing a certain action, it is it's not considered to have been properly fusion summoned. So if it leaves the field, you like goes to the graveyard, for example, you can't special summon it from the graveyard with a card effect because it was not properly fusion summoned if you use like the other condition of special summoning. Just so you know. Same goes with sort of every other mechanic of extra deck monsters. Synchro monsters, this is an inherent special summon. I will say though, for fusion summoning, if it's like a regular fusion summon with polymerization or invocation or any sort of fusion, quote unquote fusion spell card, that is not an inherent special summon. That is a special summon via card effect. There are essentially two types of summons in the game, or two types of special summons rather, and that is inherent and via card effect. Synchro summoning is an inherent special summon. What this means is that synchro monsters are synchro summoned by sending synchro materials from your field to the graveyard. It's a number of tuner and non-tuner monsters. I kind of explained that earlier, but the levels of the synchro materials must add up to the level of the synchro monster you wish to summon. And then sometimes like these monsters in the extra deck will list specific or generic materials to use. That's just how they work. But that's the overview of synchro summoning. Ixie summoning, you overlay the monsters, you physically put them on top of one another. The levels have to match. On the card it'll say 2 level 8 monsters or 2 level 3 fiend monsters. Sometimes it'll give a qualification, sometimes it won't. It just depends. Ixie summoning is an inherent special summoning mechanic. And unlike the other forms of extra deck special summoning, Ixie summons do not send monsters from the field to the graveyard because they just stack them on top of each other. And then, of course, Ixie's monsters have effects that will require you to detach materials. That is removing a card from underneath the Ixie's monster that is overlaid, sending it to the graveyard to activate the effect, but this does not count as sending the card to the graveyard. The best way to describe the sort of position of Ixie's materials, which by Ixie's materials I refer to the cards that are under the Ixie's monster that are overlaid, the best way to describe their location is in limbo. So what this means is that they're basically nowhere. They're not on the field, they're not in the graveyard, they're not banished, they're nowhere. That's just how that sort of works. Link summoning. This is another form of inherent special summoning. You just send like materials from the field to the graveyard. It's kind of like synchros, but like with less restrictions, essentially. These are unique because they don't have defense points or levels. They have link arrows and link ratings. And of course, like I've been saying this entire video, link monsters, when they're special summoned to the extra monster zone, and they point to main monster zones on the field, you can special summon monsters from the extra deck to the zones link monsters point to. Even if you special summon a link monster from a graveyard, and it has an arrow that points to a main monster zone on your field, you can special summon monsters from the extra deck to zones that they point to. It doesn't have to be a link monster in the extra monster zone, just to clarify that. And if this sounds confusing, it is. It's just a lot easier once you practice it. So I kind of mentioned co-linking earlier, but this is what it means when it's co-linked. So we have two monsters here. We have a decode talker in the extra monster zone. Its arrows point up, bottom left, and bottom right. We have another link monster on our field, Sky Striker, a Shizuku. It has one arrow because it's a link 1 monster, and it points to the top right. If you notice here, Shizuku and Talker, they point to each other. This means that they are co-linked. If two link monsters are co-linked if they point at each other. So what you can do with this is perform what is called an extra link. This means you have co-linked monsters on your field that go from one extra monster zone to the other. Typically, well really, always, if you don't have an extra link going on, you can only control a monster in one of the extra monster zones. It wouldn't be fair if you could just put 2 in different zones, because then your opponent couldn't play the game in a lot of cases. So here, because these are all co-linked, you can see Link Spider points down to Firewall, Firewall points up to Link Spider, Firewall also points right to Honeybot, Honeybot points left to Firewall, Honeybot also points right to the other Firewall, this Firewall points left to the Honeybot, and this Firewall points up to the Link Spider, and Link Spider points down to Firewall. This they're all co-linked, if you can see that there. And so you can extra link your opponent that way. But typically this doesn't happen. I know in, what was it, like mid-2018, for a long time in 2018, there was a deck, a lot of decks that used Firewall Dragon, the card in this picture, to extra link their opponents and do all sorts of crazy stuff. Thankfully, Firewall Dragon is now banned for competitive play, but extra links were a little bit more common about a year ago. So, in conclusion, the turn player can conduct any form of special summon besides pendulum summoning during the main phase in a simplified game state any number of times. It does not take away the person's normal summoner set they get for the turn, and most special summoning takes place during the main phase, although there are, of course, cards and effects that allow players to special summon at other times, just depending on like the inherent mechanics of the card or how the cards work. And once you read the cards, once you get sort of in tune with those effects, it's a little bit easier to figure this out. Alright, so now we're going to talk about battling. This is one of the more complicated parts of the video in theory, but in practice it's really kind of easy. So the battle phase has 4 different steps. You have the start step, the battle step, the damage step, and the end step. The start step, well, it starts the battle phase. That's kind of how it works. The start step starts the battle phase. Pretty self-explanatory. The first player to go in a duel, if I haven't mentioned this already, cannot conduct their battle phase. It's kind of unfair if you get to put a whole bunch of monsters on board and just attack your opponent who's done nothing and who has no monsters. Kind of unfair. The battle step, in this step, the turn player chooses one of their monsters and a monster their opponent controls to do battle. So what you do is you choose a monster you control, and you say, okay, my monster targets your monster for an attack. And you choose specific monsters, obviously. Each face-up attack position monster you control is allowed 1 attack per battle phase, and you do not have to attack with monsters if you don't want to. Now, of course, there are always caveats to these rules. Sometimes there are monsters that say, this card can attack all monsters your opponent controls once each. Or sometimes it'll say, it'd be like, this special summon monster must attack all monsters your opponent controls, or must attack if able. In those cases, you can't really rely on these mechanics because those card effects overrule these. The damage step, so after you go into your battle step, then it's the damage step. This is where damage is calculated. And there's a whole bunch of rules here that are really easy to understand that sort of explain like what happens when monsters do battle. So at any time, if a monster attacks a face-down defense position monster, which is a set monster, it's flipped face-up upon attack declaration. Now it's flipped into face-up defense position, not attack position, defense position. And so this is how it works. If a monster attacks a defense position monster, and the attacking monster has more attack than the defense of the defense position monster, the defense position monster is destroyed and no battle damage is taken by the opponent. Alright? So if I have a 2000 attack my monster, attacking my opponent's defense position 1500 defense point monster, their monster is destroyed, nothing happens. Now there are card effects. If a monster says this card inflicts piercing battle damage if it attacks a defense position monster, that means piercing damage means like you take the difference. So like in this example, if my 2000 attack monster attacked the 1500 defense position monster and it was in defense position, the opponent would take the 500 as damage to their life points. But typically, if most cards don't say they have piercing, if they don't say that, no damage is taken between attack and defense position monsters. However, if you attack a defense position monster and that monster has higher defense than your attack, let's say the rules were reversed here. Let's say my monster had 1500 attack and my opponent's monster had 2000 defense. I would take the damage as life point damage. I would take 500 damage, the difference there. But neither monster would be destroyed. The defense position monster would not be destroyed because it, survived, quote unquote, survived the battle. But my monster wouldn't be destroyed because my opponent's monster was in defense position. If the attack and defense of the monsters are equal, if my monster is in attack position and it's attacking my opponent's defense position monster, nothing happens. No battle damage is taken, no monsters destroyed, nothing happens. Typically, though, monsters are going to be attacking attack position monsters. That's how damage is dealt mostly. So, if a monster attacks the attack position monster, the attacking monster's attack is greater than the attacked monster's attack. The attacked monster is destroyed. So if I have a 2000 attack monster and I'm attacking my opponent's 1500 attack monster, and they're both in attack position, my opponent would take 500 damage, which is the difference between their attacks, and my opponent's monster would be destroyed. If my monster attacks an attack position monster, but my opponent's attack position monster is higher, if, like, let's say their monster has 2000 attack and mine has 1500, I would take that 500 difference as damage to my life points, and my monster would be destroyed. If their attacks are equal, nobody takes damage if, they're both in attack position. Nobody takes damage, and both monsters are destroyed. Now, there is something called redeclaring attacks. So, for example, if there is a card effect activated that makes a monster leave the field or a new monster is added to the field, by some sort of interaction or some sort of effect, a replay occurs. So let's say I declare an attack with my 2000 attack point monster. My opponent has an effect that allows them to special summon a monster from the graveyard that they can activate during my battle phase. So if they special summon a monster from my graveyard, or from their graveyard or whatever, I can choose to either attack that monster they special summoned or another monster on their field. I get to re-declare my attack target. However, if I choose not to attack at that time with the monster I was declaring with, that monster is still considered to have attacked or to have declared an attack, and as such, it cannot attack again in that battle phase. So basically, if you do something and your opponent, like if a replay would occur, you have to choose an attack target or that monster cannot attack for the rest of that battle phase. During the damage step, this is an important ruling with damage step effects. During the damage step, either player can only activate counter trap cards or cards that change a monster's attack and defense, or cards that specifically trigger during the damage step, or like on removal from the field. So like, for example, a popular deck right now, Sky Strikers. Sky Striker Ace Ray, if it's in the graveyard, it says if a Sky Striker Ace monster in your extra monster zone leaves the field as a result of battle or by your opponent's card effect, or if it's destroyed by your opponent's card effect, you get to special summon it from your graveyard. That is an effect that specifically happens during the damage step, or could happen during the damage step, so you get to activate it then. Now, if you wanted to activate a card in response to that, like Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, which is a hand trap that says when your opponent activates a card or effect that does any of the following, negate that effect. Special summon from the graveyard, banish from the graveyard, add from graveyard to hand. I think that's what it says, something along those lines. Your opponent cannot activate that card because they cannot activate card or effects that during the damage step that do not specifically activate during the damage step. It's kind of confusing. It's a lot easier in practice. A lot of this stuff is once you get to playing, but that's just kind of how it works. And then the end step is the last step of the battle phase. It's when the battle phase ends, obviously. Not much to do here. Just like, so the sort of like mechanics around activating card effects and stuff. Any card effects that can be activated, like spell speed 2 or higher card effects, they can be activated like during the end of any phase. So before we move on to the next one. And of course, they can be activated at appropriate times. We won't go over that much in this video, but just for future reference. So now we're going to talk about spell speeds and chains and what this whole thing means pertaining to the activation of cards. So spell speed refers to a level of prominence given to certain cards and how they can be activated in a chain. Cards with equal spell speeds, there are 3 spell speeds, 1, 2, and 3, pretty easy to figure out. Cards with equal spell speeds can be chained to one another. A card with a greater spell speed can be chained to a card with a lower spell speed, but a card with a lower spell speed cannot be chained to a card with a higher spell speed. What does chaining mean? We'll get to that a little bit later, but spell speed rankings. So spell speed 1, you have normal, equip, continuous, ritual, and field spell cards, and then you have ignition, trigger, and flip monster effects. This basically means like ignition and trigger effects are basically like effects that happen when something happens that do not say quick effect after it. And we'll get to quick effects when I talk about spell speed 2, but most monster effects, unless they don't say quick effect, are spell speed 1. Spell speed 2 are normal and continuous trap cards, quick play spell cards. So whenever I said quick play spell cards behave like trap cards, this is part of why I said that. And then monster quick effects. Now, most modern cards, actually all modern cards, I can't remember what year they changed it, but quick effects on monster cards will be denoted by the phrase during either player's turn. They used to be denoted by the phrase during either player's turn, but because we have problem-solving card text now, quick effects will say quick effect in parentheses right before like the effect of the card. And I think I have an example of this in here, but we'll see about that. And then spell speed 3, the highest spell speed, are counter trap cards. Nothing except counter trap cards can be activated in response to counter trap card activations. Now a chain is when effects are activated in response to another effect. So for example, only certain actions will start chains. Any trigger effect starts a chain. Any turn player action of activating an effect starts a chain. And then chains resolve in the opposite order of which they were built. So I think we'll go through an example here with some trap cards. So I declare an attack, and my opponent activates Storming Mirror Force. Storming Mirror Force is a normal trap card that says, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, return all of your opponent's attack position monsters to the hand. So right now, I would have to return all of my attack position monsters to the hand. Alright? But fortunately, I have a wiretap. It's a counter trap card that says, when a trap card is activated, negate the activation, and if you do, shuffle that card into the deck. So because I have wiretap, I would negate the Storming Mirror Force, so I will chain it to the activation. So right now, we have a Storming Mirror Force as Chain Link 1, wiretap is Chain Link 2. And then my opponent has a set Red Reboot. Red Reboot's effect says when your opponent activates a trap card, negate the activation, and if you do, set that card face down, and they can set one other trap directly from their deck. This would negate my wiretap. It's the third Chain Link. So we have Chain Link 1 is Storming Mirror Force, Chain Link 2 is wiretap, and Chain Link 3 is Red Reboot. So this is how it works. The chain resolves backwards from 3 to 1. So Red Reboot applies, negating my wiretap. Okay? I set my wiretap and then set another trap card from my deck, as per Red Reboot's effect. But because my wiretap was negated, my opponent's Storming Mirror Force goes through, and all of my attack position monsters return to my hand. That's how that works. That's how chains work. People sometimes will get kind of confused when asking like, why do chains resolve backwards? But it makes sense because if you're responding to something, your response takes precedence over that, typically speaking. That's why they resolve backwards. So there's some other rulings and mechanics now. We'll talk about this here. Missing timing is a thing. This concept is kind of difficult to explain. So a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards will have if and when in their card text. So I don't think I explained the card text in this video. I might a little bit later, but basically card effects sometimes have conditions when they activate. So for example, what's a good card to do this here? So if you look, let's see, let's go back here. So if you look at this card, wiretap here, it's kind of hard to see, but it says when a trap card is activated. So this says when right here. That means that you have to directly respond to that card's activation with wiretap, all right? Because it is a when effect. If it says if, though, you don't have to directly respond to it, or it doesn't directly have to activate it. Missing timing only deals with cards that have when effects. An if effect can activate if its conditions were met anytime in a chain, but a when effect can only activate if the very last action performed meets its conditions. Problem-solving card text has helped with this issue, but it is still confusing to understand. Yeah, that's all true stuff. But these sort of things you'll understand if you get more in depth with the game. Here's an example of it. All right. So, let's say my opponent activates Mystical Space Typhoon, and I have a set Silver's Cry on my field. Okay. Now, because I want to use my Silver's Cry and not, get rid of it to Mystical Space Typhoon, I'll chain my Silver's Cry to Mystical Space Typhoon. I have a Dragon Spirit of White over here in my graveyard, which is a viable target for Silver's Cry. My opponent doesn't have any response to my Silver's Cry, so the chain resolves backwards. So as the last chain link, Silver's Cry will special summon Dragon Spirit of White from the graveyard. Then Mystical Space Typhoon will destroy my Silver's Cry as chain link 1, resolving the entire chain. However, if we look at Dragon Spirit of White's effect, it says when this card is normal or special summoned, I can target a spell trap my opponent controls and banish it. Because the last action was not this card being special summoned, but Mystical Space Typhoon destroying Silver's Cry, I cannot use the effect of Dragon Spirit of White to target a spell trap my opponent controls and banish it. It misses timing. That's the term, the sort of slang term people use for it. It misses timing. If it said if this card is normal or special summoned, then I could do it, but since it says when, I cannot. That's how that works. Now here's when I talk about problem-solving card text and how the sort of activating a card works, conditions of cards, and how that stuff works. So there's two main points of punctuation concerning card effects that we need to worry about here, and that is a colon right here and a semicolon right here. With the problem-solving card text, everything before this colon right here, this is a condition that must be fulfilled in order to activate or attempt to activate the card. So for example, the card right here is called Solemn Strike, and it says when a monster will be special summoned or a monster effect is activated. So Solemn Strike, this card here, it's a counter trap card in case you were wondering. It can only be activated if this condition is met. So if my opponent special summons a monster, or my opponent activates a monster effect, then I can activate this card. Now, everything after the colon, but before this semicolon here, this is the cost of a card. So in order to activate this card, I have to perform this action right here. And a card is not considered activated until I do this. So let's say my opponent activates a monster effect. I flip over my set Solemn Strike, pay 1,500 life points to activate the card. Now at this point, my opponent can respond to it, right? They can have their own counter trap card or something to negate Solemn Strike. But I have to be able to pay this cost. I have to have, more than 1,500 life points left to pay to activate Solemn Strike. It is only after the chain resolves that this effect will resolve. But I have to be able to do this first, okay, on activation of the card. It's pretty important. It's easy to understand once you've been doing the game a while, but it's very important. Some cards don't have a specific time at which they can be activated. So like if you look at this card, Solemn Strike here, some cards will not have this condition text. They won't have a colon here. Some of them won't even have a semicolon either. For example, I showed you the normal trap card, Jar of Greed, earlier. It didn't have any of that stuff. It just said draw one card. Okay, that means you can activate it any time without paying any cost. All right. And then costs, they can be a lot of stuff. They can be life point payments, such as in the case of Solemn Strike, to be discarding cards, banishing cards, tributing, targeting, and other stuff. And like sometimes we don't really think of targeting as a cost. So for example, let's go back here to Mystical Space Typhoon. It says target one spell or trap card on the field, then it has a semicolon, destroy that target. So everything before the semicolon right there would be the cost of a card. Targeting is a cost. It's not like a cost in a typical sense, like you don't have to pay anything for it or do a negative-esque action for it, but targeting is still a cost of a card. Quick effects, so I mentioned earlier, as a spell speed 2, quick effects are that kind of spell speed. They're along the lines of non-counter traps and quick play spells. For problem-solving card text, quick effects were denoted by during either player's turn on the card text. So, for example, the quick effect will appear as, in parentheses, quick effect, capital Q, capital E there, and it'll appear in the condition part of the card. So, for example, here, this is the card text of Dragon Spirit of Light. It says, when this card, it will not appear as part of the condition part of the card. It'll appear as part of the cost of the card. No, I take that back. It will appear as part of the condition of the card here. So this one says, if your opponent controls a monster, quick effect, in parentheses, then it has the colon right after it. You contribute this card, that's the cost, because the semicolon directly follows it. Special summon a Blue Eyes White Dragon from your hand. So this means you can chain it to the activation of a card as a spell speed 2 effect. So for example, like let's say your opponent activates, what's a good card here? Raigeki Break, which is a normal trap card that says target one monster your opponent controls, destroy it. I think it says something like that. Whatever the case is, if your opponent activates that card, you can chain this card to it because it's a normal trap card you're chaining to. Activate this effect so you can sort of dodge, quote unquote, dodge that effect. And then that's about it for effects and stuff like that. It's confusing, like I said, but once you get into it, you'll figure things out. The next stuff is procedural stuff. So each player begins with 8,000 life points. I probably should have prefaced this earlier, but that's how many life points you have when you start the game. Both people shuffle their main decks and use a fair method to decide who'll go first. Usually random methods like rock, paper, scissors, or like typically in most tournaments it's rolling dice. That's what you do. High roll, usually. That the player who gets the high roll will decide if they want to go first or second. The players will draw 5 cards and they begin the game. The turn player, the first player who begins a duel, does not draw during their draw phase, and they cannot conduct their battle phase. That's kind of unfair if they did. And in general, whenever you play the game, it is best to like clearly state what actions you're performing, or like whenever you go, like whenever you leave a phase or go to a certain phase, or whenever you do something, it's just good to be clear about that, and like make sure your opponent and you know what you're doing. And it also helps if you're playing with like friends or something like that, that your opponent or other people around you are not being too distracting or anything like that. And then there's some unofficial rules for more than 2 players here. I won't really go over this, but these are some rules I made specifically for my friend group whenever we play a Battle Royale style duel. I don't know if there's actual official rules for like tag dueling or for Battle Royale style duels, but if there are, you can go ahead and probably look them up somewhere. I'm not going to cover that here. And next section here is what you need for dueling. I'm going to go through this really quick because this isn't really part of the rules of the game, but When you go to a tournament, it's important to have several things. You need to have a deck box to have your deck in. A playmat is usually recommended. Mousepad material ones are probably the best in terms of money and quality. You need to have a card sleeves for your cards. I don't know if it's a requirement. I think it might be. It might be a requirement. I'm not exactly sure, but it's probably best to have card sleeves for your cards that fit your cards well. Mini-sized card sleeves or Japanese-sized card sleeves are the ones you want for Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Standard size are too big. And you want to make sure your card sleeves are in good condition. They're not ripped, they're not bent or torn in any sort of way. That way your opponent or anybody else cannot accuse you of cheating. Then you need to have some method of keeping track of life points, typically a method that does not involve a communication device. You can't really keep track of life on your phone because you could potentially use your phone to communicate with outside sources. You can't do that. So pen and paper is the best way to go. And then dice, coins, tokens, some other stuff you need depending on what you're playing. But dice is like every duelist should have a dice or a pair of dice. That's just kind of how that works. Rules for sleeves, like I said, they have to be uniform. They have to be the same for your extra deck, main deck. Your extra deck and main deck can have the same type and color of sleeves, but I typically try to get different colors of sleeves for my main deck and extra deck. But all cards on my main deck and all cards on my extra deck have to have the same kind of sleeves, like among themselves. If your sleeve becomes damaged or marked or torn or bent or ripped, you got to change it out for a new one. All right, it's as simple as that. If you shuffle properly with your sleeves, the shuffling will be easier and you will avoid breaking your sleeves or doing something to your cards. If you have a side deck, the cards in your side deck should match the sleeves of your main and extra deck, depending on the type of cards in your side deck. Now, I will say though, for the extra deck at least, a lot of people I see at tournaments, they don't have uniform sleeves for their extra deck. There'll be different colors or different things. Typically, this doesn't matter. There are some cards that interact randomly with cards from the extra deck, in which case your opponent will have uniform sleeves for their extra deck. They'll be smart enough to figure that out. So that's for sleeves, and I think that's about it for the video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I guess we'll go back to the sleeve slide here. If you like this video, I know it was really long, but these rules take a long time to explain. It sounds a lot complicated. If you get into the game, if you get involved, if you play the game, you'll kind of understand a lot more about it. I know whenever I first started getting into competitive and like actual Yu-Gi-Oh, not like the playground stuff I used to do when I was back in middle school, when I got into actual Yu-Gi-Oh, learning rules and like watching other people play and learning from somebody how to play, that really helped with how well I did and how much I learned in this game. And I hope that you and whoever else watches this, I hope that you all can sort of understand the basics of the game and like how things work. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave comments down below, or just go to the point in the video that you have questions about and see what I have to say about it. I'm not an expert by any means on technical rulings of cards, because there are a lot of like specific, very technical rules and rulings for individual cards that I cannot explain in this video because they're just too specific for their own interactions. So that's why I'm not doing that here. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. This is Andrew from Team Blacktop YGO signing off. Thank you so much.